So first, life on the margins, and by the margins, somebody asked me outside, what do you mean by the margins? I said, well, it's people who exist on the edges of society, often those who are poorer in lots of different ways, and poverty is obviously multifaceted. So let's look at the social aspect of our lives first. What does life on the margins look like when looked at socially? And one of the first things I think to point out is it looks very, very difficult. It looks very isolating. People who live on the margins and exist on the margins have often got a very small world. Their world shrinks down to sometimes, particularly on the Isle of Man, particularly within Douglas, sometimes just within a few streets in Douglas. I remember one of the things that we do periodically at Graih is we try and take people out on social trips, so we'll go out on walks and visits out and about and all that kind of thing. And a number of years ago I was chatting to one of the guys. He said, I've never been sort of south in the island, never been to Port St Mary or Port Erin or anywhere like that. He lived here for many, many years, but his world was very, very small. It's a very lonely place. When you're existing on the margins, all the support networks that we all rely on to one degree or another, friends, family, acquaintances, colleagues, all those networks tend to be broken, particularly when we're talking about homelessness. People find themselves in a very vulnerable and isolated place. There's often, not always, but often a huge amount of pain and trauma in people's lives, sometimes reaching back right to their childhood, really difficult stories of abuse and difficulty in those early years is foundational then for the course of an individual's life. And that just really warps a young life as it's growing and causes all sorts of difficulties and trauma later on in their lives. We're often asked, is there anything specific about the guys that you see at Graih, people who are homeless? Is there anything that you can point to are they mainly like this or are they mainly like that? Are they alcoholic or are they drug addicts or is it mental health or is it this, that and the other? And really the truth of the matter is it's all of those and none of those and everything else. People are messy and the reality of life is messy and the reality of life on the margins is messy. And so it's not as if it's a one size fits all. We can say, oh, people on the margins are always like this, the poor are always like this, the homeless are always like this. It's very, very different. But if there is something that does run as a common thread through all of them, it's a sense of loneliness and of isolation. They lack that network of support. But one of the guys that I visit, and I'll be using the guys' numerous stories, I'll change their names so you probably won't be able to identify any of them. One of the guys that we've had contact with for many years, a guy called Bob, who he came to us after sleeping rough for the best part of a year. He'd been scavenging in bins for food, and this is all on the Isle of Man. And he came to us at the drop-in, very, very afraid, very, very low self-worth. Didn't want to ask for any help because he wasn't worth helping, and didn't want to really to be a burden to anyone or any services. Didn't want anything at all. And very, very slowly, as we got to sit down with him and had numerous cups of tea and chatted to him really quite gently, we began to build more of a relationship. And one of the great things about the drop-in and the volunteers that Graih has there is that we can very gently begin to build some trust with people for whom trust is often very difficult. And eventually Bob moved into some accommodation and we continued to visit and really became a surrogate family. We acted as next of kin to him when he needed to go to Liverpool for some major operations, and we still engage with him today, visit him, keeping stability, and he's in a much better place. A journey from someone who's come from a very lonely and isolated place into at least some kind of surrogate family. And when we talk about our social lives and our family lives and our houses, we talk about the importance of people on the margins. One of the things they point out very quickly is actually the defunct model of our social lives, the model of private houses and nuclear families, and we put the shutters off and shut the rest of the world away. Well, on the margins and for the poor, that simply doesn't work. That hasn't worked. Maybe it's been really bad and it's all fallen apart. Maybe people have never had family and a table to sit around and food to share. And And they show us that actually what's needed is something much more open, something much more hospitable. Over the years, I've had the privilege of being involved in a variety of shared houses where people have taken people in from the drop-in or from the streets, or people who are struggling for whatever reason and have stayed in a shared household as part of a family for a while. Sometimes that's been a few weeks, sometimes that's been a few months, sometimes that's been in years. And there's a great risk to that. There's a great risk for people coming in to a household. Who are these people? I'm not used to being in a household. I'm not used to sitting around a table and sharing a meal with people. What's that going to be like? There's a great risk to the hosts in those households. Who are we letting into our home, into our private space that socially and culturally we think is ours, and to be protected from anyone. But actually in that very vulnerability and in that mutuality, in that relationship that can be built, is where transformation really takes place. And so one of the most powerful things that we've had contact with at Graih has been when people have understood that they're entering into a relationship of support, and they've been able to have some stability and some peace in the rhythms of a family home and the rhythms of a shared environment, and have been able to find some peace and some healing with whatever problems that they face. So one of the most important lessons socially, I think, that life on the margins can teach us is the importance of hospitality, the importance of shared spaces, the importance of breaking down that model of nuclear family, private household, me against the world, the Englishman in his castle, that kind of ethos. A lady called Dorothy Day, who spawned a whole movement of really radical houses of hospitality in the US, although it spread around the world. They had sort of urban houses of hospitality where they would open it up to people who were living on the streets and share food together, twinned with sort of rural centres where people worked together on a farm. And this is in the sort of early mid-20th century it started. And one of the things that she said is it's about creating an environment where it's easier for people to be good. And hospitality and shared houses really do that. They create an environment where it's easier for people to find some healing, to find some peace, to make some better decisions in their lives and move forward. It really emphasizes the importance of kindness and of community rather than the individualism that can so often take over in wider society. So that's a little bit of a window on our social aspect of our lives and life at the margins. What about the economic aspects? What does life at the margins look like when we think a little bit more about economics? We don't tend to talk very much about economics, and yet it really is one of the major powers in our lives that sort of shapes so much of what we do, where we spend a lot of our time in terms of paid employment, or what it does in terms of our island, in terms of the economies and the sectors that are economically productive. What does life on the margins look like in an economic sense? Well, it looks like poverty, and that means material poverty. And even on the Isle of Man, in this very affluent and peaceful society, and we have people who struggle for food, struggle for shelter, struggle for the basic necessities of life, and have very little money. And within all of that, there's then a really damaging cycle of self-worth. I alluded to Bob earlier, and it's shared by many of the guys that we see. I remember one of the guys that we did a whole load of interviews with them a number of years ago, and one of the guys speaks very powerfully. Vincent, he says when you're standing outside Markwell House, which is where you sign on for benefits, government benefits, he said when you're standing outside Markwell House on its signing on day for job seekers, he said you stood outside, there's a big queue going out the door, and he said I've stood outside there, and he said and you watch the taxi drivers going past and they look at you like you're a piece of dirt. He said that's what it feels like to be at the bottom of society, on benefits, desperate for work, looking for work, not being able to find any. He said I feel like a piece of dirt is what I feel like. Now whether the taxi drivers were looking at him and thinking that, who knows, but that's certainly the perspective that he had. He thought that people were sort of judging him in that position of being in need and in need on benefits. And then the damage that does to your mental health and your well-being and your sense of purpose and value, if that's tied up in your economic productivity, then you're going to really suffer when society says, well, actually, you're not economically productive. And life on the margins for the poor exists economically in the context of all these value structures. We always say, don't we, what value can you put on human life, and all these sorts of nice sentiments, but actually the economy does put quite specific values on human life. It sets benefits at certain levels. It says certain people in certain sectors are worth more than others. For some reason, e-gaming executives are worth a lot more than nurses or teachers, for example, and those are just economic decisions that we've made about what our values are. And then society then holds up those values to judge ourselves against. We're all invited all the time, aren't we, in the media that we consume, to judge ourselves on our levels of consumption and productivity, on are we being efficient, and are we being economically productive, and are we contributing to the growth of the economy and all these important things. And yet the poor teach us that for many people that doesn't work at all. And for many people, actually, that's a deeply damaging and deeply warped value structure that sort of seeps into our collective consciousness. And the hand of the market that sometimes needs to be appeased in every single way, and sort of we think, well, what's good for the markets, what's good for the economy, and it's very rare that we think, well, actually, what's good for people? Are we the economy's servants, or are we its masters? And how does that work, and what does that look like? So many of the guys I think of Dave is, people have got all these assumptions about people on the margins, no problem, and there's particularly in the UK, particularly over the last number of years, I think, there's been more and more rhetoric, hasn't there, about benefit scroungers. There's times of austerity. We haven't got as much money as we used to. We're all in it together. I don't know who came up with that one. And saying, actually, it's the people at the bottom who need to, they're a drain, they're not contributing anything, so they need to get a grip and move on and get them into work and all this kind of thing. And without any consideration of where huge amounts of wealth and power are concentrated at the sort of the upper levels of the economic ladder. And many of the guys that we see really want to work. I always say to people, they say, well, people assume that work is some sort of enemy to be avoided. I said, have you ever spent time with people who've not had any work for years and years? I said, they're desperate for meaning. We all need purpose in our lives. We all need activities to do that make us feel valued. And work is an important part of that. Dave, one of the guys at the drop-in, is absolutely desperate for work and has been for many, many years. He's not got a great deal of education and spent a lot of time on the building sites with his dad growing up. Got a huge amount of practical skills. Big guy, really strong, and really enjoys cranes particularly. He's really good. He was like driving cranes since he was 5 or something ridiculous, and so he's got all these skills. But he's badly epileptic. And so he's not allowed to work with heavy machinery, and whenever he goes to any employers to try and get even just some general work, as soon as they learn that he's epileptic, they say, oh, no, we can't take the risk. And so here is somebody who's desperate to give to society, desperate to work, and yet isn't able to. And we don't yet have within businesses, within our wider economy, it's very rare to find businesses with the flexibility for people like Dave, who's epileptic but really wants to work. He could be employed in lots of different ways, but would need a lot more flexibility from an employer. Rare to find that. Why would an employer in an economy that's focused on growth and profit prioritise being flexible for somebody with slightly more needs when they can just take somebody who'll just do exactly what they say, more in the mainstream? And so many of the guys point out that importance of being masters of the economy rather than its servants. They also point to a great deal of generosity. So much of our economic thinking is premised on, well, I've earned my money and that's mine, and I need to protect that, and we're worth what we earn, and all that sort of rhetoric. And yet I found that astonishingly, you find a huge amount more generosity sometimes with people who have almost nothing than you do with people who have got quite a lot. I think of Ian, one of the older guys that we saw many years ago. We had contact with a couple of Romanians who had come over, looking for work, not quite realising the work permit system and the difficulties of navigating that, and it ended up on the streets in Douglas. And one of the other guys who was on the streets, a Manx resident who'd been on the streets a long time, took them under his wing, and I remember Ian showed them how to survive and where to get some rest and where to get some shelter, and was very generous to them. And I remember him saying to me, he said, why do I need 2 t-shirts? He said, I can only wear 1 t-shirt at a time. He said, if somebody wants a t-shirt, give them a t-shirt. I've only got 1, and I only need 1 to wear at the moment until I'm going to have a wash and a clean one. And so there was a very much of a lightness to the few possessions that he had, and was able to share much more abundantly with people. And in that sense, the poor on the margins teach us that maybe there's something in simplicity that makes it easier to share, easier to enter into an economy where we support one another and share with one another, rather than it being something competitive, trying to grab as much as we can for ourselves. So that's a window a little bit on our social lives, on our economic lives as individuals and as society. What about politically? What does life on the margins look like politically? Politically, the margins are fairly invisible. They're fairly silent. Voices are not heard. And that's for lots of different reasons, I think. Many of the guys that we see at Graih, they're not registered voters. So they're both not interested in voting, and politicians are not interested in engaging with them because they're not registered voters. So there's very little political power there in the sort of electoral democracy that we live in. But also, I think there's then a sense of great, almost disempowerment that takes place. You know, many of the guys are affected by the same cynicism that we often get across society about politics generally. They say, what's the point? Nothing's going to change. Politicians are politicians. They're back down there with bankers, you know, and what's the point? There would be no point in voting because nothing's ever going to change. Those structures that are in place are never going to change. And for so many of the guys that we see, there's a lack of hope. There's a lack of hope that things can change, and that's either individually or as a society. They think this is just the way things are, and as soon as we lose hope, as we all of us know, if you've got no hope for anything, well, you're absolutely right, there won't be any change. People will then get stuck in the status quo that they're in, even if that's very painful, even if that's very damaging, and they'll continue to suffer there. I could talk for a long time about the sort of the problems of politically of people on the margins. They're very often the done to rather than the done with. We don't hear the voices of the poor within our political structures very well at the moment, and that goes across sort of statutory services as much as it does within business and within the third sector, within the faith community. I think we're very poor on the island at listening and engaging with people on the margins and involving them in the search for more justice. Landlords and deposits would be an instant one. Many of the guys are at the mercy of landlords who will routinely withhold deposits, who will be providing substandard accommodation, often in unregulated boarding houses where people have got little or no access to cooking, heating, sanitation facilities. And when we say, well, you know, you've got some rights here as tenants, and rights to get your deposit back when you're leaving and that kind of thing, they say, well, take them to the small claims court if the landlords aren't saying this. For people who've got a whole load of other mental health and physical problems there else, you might as well say go to the moon and get your £250 back, because that's not going to happen. So even the avenues of justice that we set up within society mostly work for people who set them up, who are educated and who are fairly wealthy and who are fairly competent and who are fairly good at navigating things like filling in forms and making phone calls and don't feel too anxious about doing that. But if you're on the margins and if you're struggling with loads of other things, that access to justice is much more difficult. And in that sense, the poor show us in a very real way who politically society works for, and it's not the poor. It's politically society works for entrenched power structures, people who are already wealthy, and whether that's wealthy individuals or corporations. The systems that we set up politically continue to perpetuate that division. We know about increasing inequality, not just within the minority world that we live in, but globally as well. The gap between the rich and the poor is becoming wider and wider, with devastating consequences for the poorest and most vulnerable. This is in the context in the Isle of Man of a very, as I said, a safe and affluent society. A couple of months ago, the Sunday Times released its rich list. I'm not sure whether they do this annually or how periodical it is, but there's always some island residents that feature there. There were 9 island residents that featured this year on the Sunday Times rich list. Their total assets were just over 11 billion that they were worth. That's 9 people. But their wealth had actually fallen since the last rich list, so they'd seen a cut in their assets. This is in a context where, again, on the island, as even worse in the UK, we're talking about cutbacks to government services, because we haven't got the money and we can't afford that. And that is really, that's just all about political choices. That's a political reality that entrenches wealth and power rather than puts it in the interests of those on the margins. And I think those who are poor on the margins also point to where political power comes from, and it doesn't come from, ironically, from wealth. From positions of power, what we think of, but it comes from below. It comes from the power of kindness, of service, of credibility, what we get when we share with one another, when we put in peace and justice as far more of a priority and move gently in that direction. So that's social aspect of our lives, some economic aspects, a little bit of reflection on some of the political aspects of life on the margins, and finally, to sort of draw it together, a few comments on the spiritual aspects of life on the margins. And many people would think, well, what does economics and politics and our social lives have anything to do with spirituality? And the answer is, well, everything. As I said at the beginning, all these areas bleed into one another. And when we talk about spirituality, I think spirituality at the margins points us to the need for a holistic approach to life, and that we're not simply social beings or economic beings or political beings as individuals or as a society, but we're spiritual beings as well, and that really brings a whole holistic sense to things. I've often found over the years that it's the poor who've got the best questions, spiritually as much as in everything else. One of the guys that we knew for a long time at the drop-in, Derek, was a very angry man, and he's dead now. And but he always had the best questions. He would sit with people who would talk about the answers that they'd found from lots of different faith traditions and perspectives and everything that, and he would then look at them and say, well, what about this and what about that, and was unafraid to really ask the very simple, often very childlike, but completely devastating questions. And I think there's something about people on the margins. There's a real honesty there. There's an integrity to the searching for peace and justice, the searching for answers, that we don't find in very many other places. And I think it's the stubbornness of the lives of the poor that really points up all the assumptions that we make in the status quo. Les, another one of the guys that we got contact with, came to us when his life was falling apart, his marriage had fallen apart, he'd had businesses in the past, a very, very successful individual, and everything had fallen apart for lots of different reasons. Relationships had gone awry, and had ended up on the streets when he came to us, alcoholic, really struggling. And again, through engagement, not just with Graih at the drop-in, but with a whole variety of other people, began to find some peace and some healing and some freedom. And I still sit with him, and Les says to me, he said, what really made a difference was not what people said, was not the words that people used. He said it was who people were. When he met people at the drop-in, when he met people at Stauros, which is a Christian agency serving people in it with problems with addiction, he said, when I met people, he said it was who they were that spoke much more powerfully than what they said. It was something about the quality of their life and the quality of who they are as a person, their integrity and their honesty and their gentleness and their love that really struck me and made me think there is hope, and I want something of that, and I want to find out how to get there. And again, there's something about the honesty of those on the margins that really invites us to imagine something different. And I think from within my own faith tradition, I'm a Christian, and it's that journey to the margins and the centrality of the poor that's absolutely central within the Christian tradition. Much to the contrary of the church entrenching wealth and power over too many years. But the whole movement of Jesus in incarnation is all about God moving to the margins, identifying himself with people who are the poor, who are the hungry, who are the prisoner, who are those in need, and saying this is where life is to be found. These are the people who society says they've got it all mixed up, they're all broken, they're useless, they're worthless, they've made too many mistakes, there is no hope for these people, there'll always be an underclass. And yet so much of spiritual teaching, and particularly within the Christian tradition, says it's just there, it's right there where the world says these people are worthless. There Jesus says this is where you find life, this is where you find God. And in that sense, very much, the poor teach us, the poor give us a wonderful invitation for us, not just as individuals, although absolutely there's individual transformation that takes place when we engage with people on the margins. I know from my own journey in engagement at Graih, I started working with people having no idea about mental health, no idea about addiction, no idea about the wounds that people suffer. And I'm sure I've been transformed far more over the years in my relationships with people than they've been transformed by things that I've done and said. And so it's very much that mutuality is so important, and the importance of people on the margins and the poor to really reveal to us something really transformational. But also they teach us as a society what's most important. And where life is to be found, where hope is to be found. It's on the margins where peace and justice are most needed, and therefore they point up all the ways that the status quo is weighted in an unequal and unjust fashion. And in that sense, they issue a great call to freedom, a call to free ourselves from those damaging models of social, economical, political, spiritual life, a call to free us from the damaging individualism that infects so much of that. Spirituality is just as much can succumb to the temptation of individualism as every other area of our lives, and we live in a very individualistic context and society. And again, the poor stubbornly refuse to allow us to disappear into our own little worlds, whether it's our own spiritual worlds as much as anything else. And I think we're at a mindfulness festival today, and I would suggest that perhaps one of the most important aspects of mindfulness is to be mindful of and with people who are poor, people who are on the margins. It's not an isolated individual approach to life and our spiritual lives, but it's about embracing and engaging with people on the margins. And actually, when we do that, we find that completely paradoxically, that's when we find life. So many people and so many charities and so many good intentions start with saying, well, we're semi-sorted, we need to go and help the people who aren't sorted. And of course there's a degree of truth in that. I'm a much more stable person than many of the guys that I engage with at Graih, but it's far more mutual than that. And so paradoxically, I would suggest that when we journey ourselves to the margins, when we dare to be more vulnerable, when we dare to share what we have, whether that's our houses or our money or our homes or our work, when we dare to enter into the political challenge of people on the margins and make their cause our own, when we enter into solidarity with people on the margins, I would suggest very much that that's where we find life, and that's where we find the pursuit of peace and justice that makes us more whole and flourishing as human beings and as a society. I don't know if that's made any sense whatsoever to people, but if anyone's got any questions or any comments or want to have a discussion about any of those aspects, feel free. And if not, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for listening.